welcome to Behind the Scenes. I am your host, Hector Montalvo. This show is dedicated to asking tough questions for you, the viewers. We bring you their responses, and we let you decide. Joining us here today at our MCTV studios, candidate for the first Essex Senate seat, Mr. Tim Coco. Mr. Coco, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. It's only the second time I met you, and it's in the same week. So it's wonderful.
It's
and
great.
Congratulations on the award.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Very quickly, you are running for the first Essex Senate seat. You are Tim Coco. Why don't you tell the viewers, who is Tim Coco?
Very good place to start. A good place to start is, I'll tell you, I grew up in Haverhill, and I went to public schools, and I graduated from Haverhill High School. But my family's roots actually are in Methuen. My grandparents came to Methuen from Sicily in the 1920s. My grandfather worked in the mills, and he lived the American dream. He was able to buy his own home. I'm not sure everyone has that opportunity now. And my father met my mother, who was from North Andover, so we're very much involved in the district. And one of the things I think is important in this race, and I'm sure we'll get into more detail later, is education. And I had a couple of great opportunities when I was in school. Thanks to guidance counselors and teachers and smaller class sizes. You know, some students fall through the cracks. I might very well have been one of those if it hadn't been for the educators that were there. But you know, 8th graders have to make a real big decision. They have to decide whether to go to high school, vocational school, maybe agricultural school. And so my father was a self-employed plumber, worked by himself. And in my 8th grade mind, I thought, you know, I should carry on my father's footsteps, even though he used to take me on jobs and I'd clean the fittings and so on. It was the worst thing I could think of doing myself. But I thought I should carry that on. But educators looked at my grades and talked to my parents and said, you know, a college course at the high school seems to make more sense. And so that was, you know, the first time an educator got involved. And then in my junior year of high school, I had a big interest in communications and broadcasting. That's why I'm so enamored by these beautiful studios. I had a big interest in that, and I wanted an internship at a local radio station. And again, because I got this individualized attention, I think all of us did in those days, they were able to set up an internship with WHAV radio. At the time, it was 1490 AM, and then 92.5 FM was WHAV FM. And I got that internship. And everything I've done in my life is built on that, because I went from the internship to a job. Then I went to Northern Essex Community College to study while I was able to work at the radio station. I worked in all shifts. I worked with people like Tom Bergeron, who, he told the jokes, I read the news, so he's gone off to great places, like you probably will, and have to some extent. And then from there, I was able to stay in the news business. I went to the Haverhill Gazette when it was a daily, and I covered City Hall. I later went on to the Daily News of Newburyport. And then in 1991, I started my own business, which is an advertising and public relations firm.
Now, sounds like you've been in the private sector all your life.
That's right. I'm not a politician.
You're not a politician.
Never run for public office in my entire life.
So what made you decide to run for this seat?
Well, you know, all of us, I suppose, especially having been a reporter, I expect accountability and transparency. You know your job. You've got to dig to find things. And I think sometimes the public has to dig a little too hard and doesn't really get the results it's seeking. So it's always been a little bit of a burning issue for me. And then the last few years, I mean, these last 4 years have been really tough since the collapse of our economy. And although, Washington is saying some great things about numbers, we know that those numbers aren't the greatest, and that people have fallen off the unemployment roll, so they aren't even counted anymore. And then we have people who went back to work. I know an engineer who worked at Lucent with Western Electric, ended up working, sweeping the floors at a Lowe's store. And so obviously here's a person who doesn't want to be on the unemployment rolls, wants to work, but can't bring in the same kind of money. So I saw this absolute lack of opportunities. I work with small businesses. That's my client base, small businesses. And these last 4 years have been a terrific struggle. And I don't, okay, much of this is national. But our state plays a role in this. And the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, seems to pick and choose winners. You may have heard last year this big debate over Fidelity Investments, among other mutual funds, got these big tax breaks as an incentive to create jobs. But we found out last year they were still taking the tax breaks, but sending the jobs to Rhode Island and New Hampshire. I think oftentimes our legislature looks at something once, and it might sound like a good idea at the time, but they never go back to check their work. And so here we are, all of these tax breaks add up to $5.1 billion, and I would say almost none of them go to small business. And small business isn't looking for a handout. They just want a level playing field. And it's hard to have a level playing field when our legislators are picking and choosing winners. So those are among the reasons I ran. 30 years of built-up anxiety, and here was an opportunity to address those.
Let me ask you, what do you think is the most important issue facing the 1st Essex District?
Well, there's certainly a disparity in education funding. Now this is going to be a little bit of history, and I don't want to bore your viewers, but back when Prop 2.5 passed, it answered a long-time request to bring taxes under control. But the way it did it was a community that was spending well above its means was frozen at that level. And a community that often gave its citizens back, lower taxes, maybe they looked at what their needs were. Oh, we don't need to build that this year. We'll lower the taxes this year. And a number of communities that were being responsible with their tax dollars found themselves frozen at that level when Prop 2.5 passed. And so what happened is the state then comes in and starts pouring local aid into communities, but the baseline is still not correct. So you see a community like Newburyport gets about $4 million in state aid, and it's including Chapter 70 for education. And you see other communities getting substantially more. And when I was a reporter when Prop 2.5 first passed, and there were actually some wealthy communities that said, oh no, we can't use this much money, and wanted to give it back. And the state said, well, you can't. It's a craziness. And so in 1993, we passed education reform, which was the first attempt to kind of level this. The community's been a little below, try to bring them up so that no matter where you go to school in the Commonwealth, you're getting the same education. But that isn't true. Depending on where you go in the Commonwealth, you get a very different education. And I think as I told at the beginning of this, my story about having guidance counselors and teachers, right now, the unseen cuts are the guidance counselors. There are very few of those because all the emphasis now is on the teachers and MCAS tests and so on. I think we've got to take care of our kids. And a statistic I read, and I've got to follow up on the source, but these statistics said for every dollar we spend on education, we get $4 back because there are higher wages that are later taxed, fewer social programs and social services, fewer jail cells. And so I'd love to dig into that a little bit more to see if that statistic holds true here in the Commonwealth as well.
Now, you talk about the portion of, accountability and the schools and the MCAS and so on. But we know that the 1st Essex District, and including some schools here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, are actually operating under performance. What accountability would you be demanding?
Well, we have to look at the reasons for that. Well, first of all, I spoke with Bruce Menon, a city council, a school committee man in Newburyport, and I spoke to some teachers in the Haverhill public school system, and before election day, I will have spoken to most educators in leadership roles throughout the Merrimack Valley. But the Merrimack Valley has some unique issues that maybe aren't faced by other communities, and that is transient students. A student, as one educator told me, a student who goes from kindergarten through senior year of high school generally will always perform well, will pass those tests, will do well. But when a student pops in the 5th grade, and this is because of breakup of the family, it could be a military family, for whatever reason, they pop in. And so what we're seeing is that, well, if they were popping in from a 4th grade in one community, you would think the 4th grade in the other would be similar. So there's this disparity in it. So it seems like one of the biggest problems is transient students tend to upset those scores. And so it may or may not be the fault of teachers. It just may very well be that we need to look at how we do that. I was talking to a mother at the 4th of July event in Methuen, and she said that her and her husband got divorced, and her son is now living 2 streets over, and he's no longer, or daughter it may be, can no longer go to the same school because, well, that's the line. You go to this school, you go to that one. And I think sometimes we create these artificial barriers. I mean, especially with school choice and other things, we're trying to take down these barriers, and we're finding in our neighborhood, a student can't just go back and stay in the school. So it seems like a lot of these are policies that need to be addressed.
Now, we hear about the corruption up in Beacon Hill. We know that 3 speakers have been indicted and gone to jail for the corruption up in the Beacon Hill area. Which brings me to this question. We know that there's been stories that give the impression that elected officials are above the law. Should all legislation apply to the legislators as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely shameful that we've had these speakers indicted. You know, the good news is perhaps is that we caught them, but I wonder how many haven't been caught. And so you worry about those kinds of things. And again, I've never been a politician. I've never run for office. And so I'm hoping to bring a different perspective and an independent voice. But, you know, I've always believed in ethics. Actually, my company has what we call it a resolution of principles. I mean, my employees aren't allowed to enter into certain contests because the prizes actually conflict with perhaps the client's goals, like art contests and so on. So I've always believed in very, very strong ethical underpinning, and I have to thank my parents for that. I mean, my parents, you know, they were blue collar. You know, my father, like I said, was the sole breadwinner. My mother stayed at home with the kids, and in those days, one income could support a middle-class family. Now we need both parents working, which creates some of the other issues we have. And I'm not saying it could be either gender that stays home with the kids, but you know, every day we hear about these crises, and I think that's part of the issue with families.
Now, do you believe that the founding fathers intended to have career politicians?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's interesting, the Massachusetts Constitution is the oldest one of its kind in the world. And the U.S. Constitution was modeled after it. And our founding fathers at least gave us an amendment process because they knew that things do change and that adjustments are needed. I guess we'd have to go look at our early leaders. I don't know that many of them actually stayed for lifetimes in public office. But it's a good question of what they were thinking. But they certainly gave us a method of dealing with that kind of change.
They did. Now, I'm sure you're aware of the probation scandal that's rocked the whole judiciary system. If you're elected, can I get a job at the probation department?
I'm sorry, unless you're qualified. And it seems to me that they've overfilled it, so it should take us a while to wean us off the people who are there. No, that's exactly the kind of thing. And you know, depending on where else we go in this interview, there are many examples like that. You know, every city and town that gets state aid, you know, the so-called cherry sheet, originally the color of the paper these things were on, there's actually a big deduction before the city or town gets the money. And those deductions include things like the MBTA and regional transit authorities, like Merrimack Valley Regional Transit Authority. And so everyone says, well, let's have more local aid, and that's probably our cities and towns need it. But who's looking at these little pockets it goes into before the city gets it? And I've seen very few audits of those things. And we do have a state auditor, which is a constitutional job, but that's one office against this bureaucracy that is so difficult to track. Yeah. So no, absolutely, you're going to have to wait in line for that probation job.
Tell me about it. Now, we also know that the taxpayers bailed out the MBTA, as you just mentioned. How much debt do you think government can afford to take on?
Well, certainly the MBTA. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. Our legislators start out, I think, sometimes with the best of intentions. And so, was it more than 10 years ago, they looked at forward funding of the MBTA. Okay, it used to be that the MBTA would run up a bill, and at the end of the year, give it to the Commonwealth to pay, rather than having accountability during, okay, we're a little over budget this month, let's cut back next month. Instead, oh, it doesn't matter what we spend, they're going to pick up the check. So our legislators, I think correctly, went and said we've got to address this forward funding. But what happens is 10 years later, they never went back to look at what they did to see whether it worked. And so it's a big problem. They tied it to a sales tax, a percentage of the sales tax. Well, that never materialized. Someone should have looked and said, this is how much revenue, and if we're not going to get that much the following year, go back and adjust it rather than run up the bill. So your premise is absolutely correct. We could have addressed this before this debt became almost too large to handle. Now, I should tell you, the regional transit authorities still have backward funding. And I think that one of the solutions to, is probably true of many agencies, but particularly true in transportation, is that we have, for example, the Merrimack Valley Regional Transit Authority, and then there's kind of this artificial border, the Lowell Regional Transit Authority. I'm not sure that those agencies are so different that we couldn't find some efficiencies by consolidating them, and perhaps make more efficient bus routes so that people aren't going to a connection and then waiting for another bus from another town. It just seems to me it's common sense. In my business, and I'm sure here, you're looking for efficiencies all the time. None of us have the ability to go just send off the bill to someone else.
Correct. Now, you mentioned earlier in the program that you talk with a lot of business owners, small business. What plans do you have to help border communities, small business in border communities?
Well, there's a couple things. The idea of border communities suggests that maybe our sales tax is an issue. That's difficult to address other than just bringing it down in general. It's difficult to address because let's just say that we give Methuen, Haverhill, Merrimack, we'll give anyone touching the New Hampshire border a lower sales tax. Well, what that does is it moves the border back, so then people, in Andover and other places are saying, well, now we're being harmed because now the people who were going here will now just go a little bit further to Haverhill and Methuen. So I don't think moving the border makes a lot of sense. But to your other question, I'm sure you've seen the very few that are left, the little hardware stores in our cities and towns. And one of them, Ed Chernesky, Sioux City Hardware, there's also True Value in across the river. And I was talking to Ed Chernesky, and he said, the city issues Home Depot cards to the employees to pick up, supplies, brooms, things that are below the bid law, things that they don't have to really do much with, and it's just convenient to give them that card, so they go over the border into New Hampshire and buy from Home Depot. To me, this is just craziness, but there's nothing to stop it unless we bring out a local preference law. Now, we have to be careful, because as I said, the legislature creates something and then never goes back to check its work. We got to make sure that we don't create a system where we're enriching people beyond their wildest dreams. They'll have to be reasonable. If the price difference is a few pennies, I think it's worthwhile for the cities and towns to pay a few pennies extra for a rake or a broom because that business is paying local personal property taxes and other things, income taxes to the Commonwealth and so on. So I haven't heard anyone discuss the idea of a local preference. You look at our cities and towns, sometimes it's follow the leader. Well, that town bought from this company in North Carolina, I guess they must be good, when there might be 3 local businesses that can provide that. But I certainly want to make sure we're not enriching someone, as long as these are reasonable differences. But the idea of actually exacerbating the problem by sending local city workers over the border to buy things seems to be a bigger problem.
Now, you're running as a Democrat.
That's right.
And you do have 2 other Democrats running alongside of you for the 1 seat that's available for the 1st Essex Senate seat. What makes you different from them 2?
Well, I'm the only one not on the public payroll. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with people who are doing public service, but sometimes they forget about the public part. What I think I bring to this is an independent voice. I'm not bound by the baggage that often follows politicians, the favors to repay, the old way. You know, one of the things that it bothers me when I see it in a store or a bank, when you ask, well, gee, what's your policy on this? Why is that policy? And the answer will always be, well, I don't know, that's the way we've always done it. And if it trickles through local businesses, you know it's at the state. And I think when sometimes politicians just see that, well, this is the way we've always done it, I just reject that argument. And so I think I bring an independent voice and a fresh way of looking at these things.
So you bring in an independent voice. We know that it's all Democrats up at Beacon Hill. We know that they're all attorneys up in Beacon Hill as well. You're not an attorney. You've never been a politician. How do you intend to work with the status quo that so many people think it's broken right now?
Well, it's certainly going to be a challenge for any freshman senator. But beyond that, you know, you don't survive in business 21 years if you don't get along with people. And I can break down those barriers, always have been able to. I work with people. When I was a reporter, I had to work with people of all kinds of stripes and look at it objectively, as you do. And so I think that we can talk among the legislators, we can make the case, but you know, I have a weapon that I think everyone has. I'll go to the press, I'll go to the media, and explain what's happening. And you know that'll bring pressure to bear on our legislators.
Let me ask you this question, and you know, I know that the Republicans got an opportunity to answer this particular question on a recent debate that was held by MCTV. But studies show that children do better when both parents are involved. Do you believe that children have the right to have both parents involved in their lives after a separation and divorce? And if so, will you support shared parenting legislation for all the fit parents so children have the right to have access to both parents?
If the child is protected, I mean, let's just assume that one of these parents is not a dangerous person. If the child is protected and all things being equal, I think for the best interest of the child, as I mentioned that situation of the student in Methuen, the best interest of the child, it seems to make sense that where possible, where there's no danger, that both parents being involved in the upbringing of the children. If there are some unusual issues, I would hope those would be addressed by the courts. And as I watched one of your previous shows, sometimes the courts don't address things very well. And I think the solution to that is greater transparency. You know, at the same debate you're talking about, they talked about how things get attached to other pieces of legislation and then get passed because it's part of a bulkier package. Well, what I would like to see, and I will push for, is that this information is posted to the web in advance of the vote and after the vote, so we know what's being debated, what's included, and what the outcome was. None of these, you know, three people happened to be in the chambers and voted, and that's how we got a law.
Well, let me just interrupt you there. The president made that particular statement in his first term when he was running, and he said he wanted to do that particular thing. But yet we've seen that everything that they passed, the health care bill, that wasn't even put online, and they voted to pass it, and then they started asking questions later. Do you really think that would work?
Well, I would hope that we're not going to be passing 2,000-page bills, for one thing, and put it online. But, you know, and there are people who don't have internet access, but then our media will be able to get that information and share it. I mean, I just think it's all about transparency and accountability. I think what happens in Washington, and you know, we're going to work to make sure this doesn't happen in the Commonwealth, is that there's a bunch of different interests, like attaching things to bills and so on. And I think, you know, frankly, the lobbyists, that's why we have the $5.1 billion in tax breaks. They're small businesses who actually generate 99.7% of all the jobs don't have a lobbyist. And so we've got to make sure we keep the lobbyists at bay too, because that's where those weird amendments come from.
And it does take 5 years for a small startup business to know whether or not they're going to survive in the Commonwealth. So if you're elected, you will be bringing some type of relief as legislation for those small business owners.
Yes, I think what small business is really looking for is the level playing field. If we can do local purchasing preferences, that's one of those areas. But you know, one of the things I've said during this campaign is if an employer can't afford health insurance for him or herself, how are we going to expect them to pay for it for their employees? We need to bring down the cost of insurance.
Well, what are you hearing from your constituents?
You know, I've been doing door-to-door, you know, for the old-fashioned campaign, door-to-door. I've been to all the communities, still working on it. We have a few weeks to go. And people seem to like this refreshing message, that there's someone who actually comes to the door, asks them questions, listens to their answers. And I really am interested. I don't claim to have all the answers. And I want to hear from people. Because if we go in with our own frames of reference where we just think we know it all, well, we're just going to have more of the same. We've got to hear from the people. And people, I haven't had a bad day out there. You know, you'd expect you're going to get someone who's having a bad day. What are you doing at my door? No, actually, people seem to be, first of all, they're relieved I'm not selling anything.
That's always a good thing. But let me ask you this. I'm going to give you that opportunity to have people reach out to you and get your message. Why don't you look at this camera here and pitch your pitch to the people as to why you should be their choice to be the next senator for the 1st Essex District.
Well, thank you. I'm not a politician. I've never run for public office before. What I am is a small business owner and an active community leader. I bring an independent voice, and if you're looking for an independent voice to represent you in the state Senate, then I ask for your vote on September 6th in the Democratic primary.
And if anybody needed to get a hold of you or wanted to send you an email or wanted to go on your Facebook page, donate to your campaign, how do they go about doing it?
The easiest way to do that is to go to my website where you can access email, you can access all the information and including the Facebook links and Twitter, and that's at Coco, C-O-C-O, the number 4, Senate.com, Coco4Senate.com.
Well, we want to wish you all the luck out in the campaign trail, and we want to thank you for taking the opportunity to come in to address the constituents who will be voting for you, voting hopefully in this election. Thank you for coming in. We want to thank you at home for watching. You've been watching Behind the Scenes. Join us next time as we go behind the scenes to ask the tough questions, bring you their responses. We let you decide. Thank you for joining us.